Hello, everyone across the country. My name is Huajing Maski, and I'm the Executive Director of the University of Kentucky's Office of China Initiatives. So the recent rise in anti-Asian racist violence illuminates the need for increased support and protection for Asian Pacific Islander students, and among them, international students as well. We're very happy to work with the Latitudes and its writer and publisher, Karen Fisher, to bring this much needed discussion to you. Today's webinar convenes innovative practitioners in the field of international education from various institutions in the country, and the international students from the University of Kentucky. Actually, one of the students is actually right now in Malaysia, and he's still trying to get on. So on behalf of the University of Kentucky, I would like to thank today's panel moderator and panelists. Just a little housekeeping. So throughout our discussions, our backstage administrators will put in the chat resources provided by the panelists for you ahead of the time so that you can grab before you go. Also, this session will be recorded, and we will send the recording together with the resources provided by our panelists to today's participations as well. We have an overwhelming number of registrations for this event, and so it went beyond our Zoom capacity. So we're going to live stream on Facebook. So those who are on this webinar, please put your questions into the Q&A box. And for those on Facebook, you can raise your questions in Facebook, and our staff will take your questions and post them in the webinar's Q&A. And our moderator will come to those questions in the end. So now it is my greatest pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Ms. Karen Fisher. Karen Fisher is a longtime higher education journalist with a focus on international education, including American colleges' activities overseas, the globalization of the college experience, and study abroad. Her extensive reporting on international student recruitment and the experience of foreign students in the US has been collected in Chinese Journey, Students Migration, Family Dreams, and What Happens Next. Her work has appeared in the Chronicle of Higher Education, the New York Times, the EdSource, the Washington Monthly, and University World News. She publishes a weekly newsletter on global education, Latitudes. Ms. Fisher is also a research associate at the Center for Studies in Higher Education at the University of California at Berkeley, and an International Education Leadership Fellow at the University at Albany. She is a recipient of the East-West Center's Jefferson Fellowship for Reporting in Asia and the International Reporting Project Fellowship. Her work has been honored by the Education Writers Association, the National Press Foundation, and the Poynter Institute. So without further ado, Karen, over to you.
Well, thank you, Yuezhong. It's great to be here with you all today, and it's great. I mean, one of the silver linings, I think, of this pandemic is we're able to, bring together this great panel, from all across the world to share their expertise, quite literally from across the world. We hope if Kuhan can join us. I don't want to take up much of your time again. I just want to encourage you. We're going to reserve time at the end for your questions, and we want to take them. So please post them in the chat. But I do want to, without preamble, just get into our conversation, our discussion. As Wagner noted, we have a mix of experts and students, and we want to share that expertise with you. So Katie, let me begin with you. Katie is a associate professor of higher education at the at Texas A&M University Commerce. And Katie, I know your research has looked at racism and discrimination both in the international student context and also for domestic students of color. And I wonder if, to begin with, I could ask you, are there ways that we should be thinking about international students' experience and their perceptions of race and racism in a way that's different than in the American student context?
Thank you for the question, Karen. So this is very important point. So there's definitely a clear distinction on the perception and experiences of race and racism among international students of color and domestic students of color. So many international students of color, I would even say not many, most of international students of color are coming from mono-ethnic nations, unless they are from Canada or European countries. So being born and raised in mono-ethnic country means that international students were never or rarely exposed to the issue or even a topic of race or racism or racial discrimination. So if you can imagine, they were the dominant group and majority or in the mainstream in their home country because there's only one race and they are the part of that race. So, and then all of a sudden, their status changed to minority. So the racial and ethnic minority in terms of that. So I heard from international students that I work together or from my research participants that one of the most stressful factors as international students is that they became minoritized and marginalized individual all of a sudden in the US as an international student because of their race. And they call that as a minority stress because they were stressful and in majority groups, like they were not stressful, they were successful and in majority group in their home country during their entire life before they come to the States. So therefore, racism and racial discrimination are more painful and very sudden to them. On the contrary, for domestic students of color, race and racism, this is the topic, something that they experienced and reflected since they were very young. And they know that, they know what it is and they fight for this, and there are allies that they turn to already. So because this has been part of their experiences in life. But this is not the case for international students. They don't know what to do. This is new experience for them. They have no allies to support. So if you understand this unique experience and background of international students, again, they sometimes don't clearly know if this is a racism or a microaggression because these experiences are new to them. So therefore, it is not always easy for international students of color to report or speak up or even talk about it publicly because they are not sure what it is sometimes. Also, at the same time, international students are confused if the discrimination that they experience is a form of racism or discrimination against their citizenship or the international status or their language. They don't know what it is. It is very subtle to differentiate if this is racism or linguicism or nativism or both or everything mixed up. They don't know. So speaking of intersectionality, domestic students of color, they experience racism due to their race. But for international students of color, it is either racism or nativism or linguicism or both or everything. So because of their race, their F1 temporary visa status or because their English proficiency, they don't know. So it is very important to consider all of these different layers of minoritized identities for international students. And it's definitely notable that these are different from domestic students of color.
Well, thanks, Katie. And I want to turn now, I think it's really important to hear, not just to talk about international students, which can sometimes be our tendency professionally, but to really hear their voices. And Ruwen, I want to bring you in. You're a PhD candidate in gender and women's studies at the University of Kentucky. And I I want to ask, just your own personal experience. I mean, you just heard what Katie said. I saw you nodding your head, and I'm curious what your experience was coming here, and then what is it, what your ideas were of racism in the United States coming here, and how have they shifted?
Thank you for this question, Karen. It's a really good question. And yes, what you noticed, right? Like when I hear what Katie said, I just constantly nod my head because it exactly matched with my experience. I spent my first 25 years in China, and I never saw myself as a racial identity at all. Like before I came to the U.S., I think that's a privilege of being a member of the dominant race in the culture. But I do remember vividly, after I came to the US, there's this one tiny example make me realize I'm suddenly such a visible existence. Like that was a graduate seminar. And after the graduate seminar, I was ready to pack my things and leave the classroom. And suddenly I noticed a hair on my chair. The chair was a white chair. And immediately I recognized that is my hair, because it's dark brown hair, and nobody else in that classroom has dark brown hair. Like all my classmates are white, Caucasian origins. And I just realized that never before in my life have I, recognized a hair as myself in a classroom immediately. Because when I was in China, most people, or actually it's actually okay to say everybody has dark brown hair. So that moment I just realized suddenly I am this visible existence, like almost, what I do, what I say can be immediately recognized as this is me, like nobody else actually look like this in this setting. And I noticed other people do treat me that way. Like in classroom discussions, when I talk to people, they immediately expect me to represent Asian or represent China. When we talk about China issue, they immediately want me to answer the question. And honestly, I cannot, right? I'm just this one single individual. How can I answer a question to represent Asian or China? And the concept of Asian is also a pretty absurd one. Like you put so many people from these different countries, like they're different in culture, language, and sometimes in physical appearance, and you just dump them together and call them Asian. And honestly, after 4 years in the US, I still personally reject this racial category Asian. But at the same time, I honestly have to acknowledge that my individual rejection seems really powerless, compared to the history and current condition, how people like me, how Asian people are treated differently, according to this category.
Yeah, that's a sort of must be a strange kind of eye-opening phenomenon to suddenly be expected to almost be the spokesperson for not just a country, but a continent. That's a lot to that's a lot of weight to bear. I want to bring in Yuezhong. You're in this interesting position. I mean, you work in international student programming at the university, or at Arizona State University, rather. But you and actually Katie as well are kind of here and wearing two hats, because I know you first came here as an international student. I want to tap your professional expertise, but I also want to ask you a little bit about your own path that you traveled, and then how has it informed the work that you do at ASU?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Curry. I think as Katie and Ruwen have pointed out, that every Asian international student's racialization and minoritization experience are very different. And some of them were gradual, and some of them, realize that they're Asian in one incident, as Ruwen mentioned. But for me, it was more of a graduate process. So when I first came to the US, same as Ruwen mentioned, I didn't see myself as Asian. I saw myself as Chinese, first and foremost. My nationality was my primary identity. I knew about the racialized categories before I came to the US, but I never thought that they applied to me. Like I never really, considered myself Asian until later on. And when I first stepped on the campus of College William and Mary in Virginia, I feel like my experience was very different from Asian American experience, Asian Americans that I met on campus. I always felt like as a student on F1 status, my experience just added another layer of challenge. I wasn't speaking English fluently. I had the challenge of, getting authorization, working off campus. So then I don't see myself as part of them as well. But later on, I noticed that I had a lot more friends who are people of color than my white counterparts. And I felt like I had more similarities and connections with my Asian American friends. For example, the food that we all love and the festivals that we celebrate together. And when I went to their homes for Thanksgiving, I could speak Mandarin with their parents. So then I felt like we had more similarities than what I shared with my white friends. So then I, started to realize that my experience, a lot of my experience was part of kind of students of color's experience on campus, especially in terms of how many of us were in a room, in a small classroom. A lot of the times I was the only people of color in the classroom. And then as I kind of be on the after I started working at ASU, I kind of be on the other side of the table, I realized that not all of my Asian international students identify as Asian. So I think it's really important to recognize that. And when we provide support and programming for our Asian international students, we can't just, advertise a event targeted for AAPI students for our international students, because when they see Asian American Pacific Islander student event, they don't necessarily see themselves as part of the targeted audience. I think we need to be, one thing that I learned is that we need to be a little bit more conscious of how we provide our support for them when it comes to racism and xenophobia, because as we've talked about before, everyone's racialized experience is different, and depending on their level of socialization and acculturation in the US, brand new international students, they might necessarily see themselves as Asian. So I think that's one thing that educators and universities need to be aware of.
Before I move on to Kelly, I just want to follow up on that very quickly. I mean, when you have this when you're acknowledging that diversity of experience, which I think is really critical, how do you accommodate the fact that everybody is in such different places when you've got such a large and diverse population?
I think it's difficult when it comes to programming. I think we try not to explicitly say in events for Asian international students, we try to make it a little bit more general, for example, international student support circle and things like that. And sometimes we invite our staff members from our counseling services. We have Japanese, Chinese, and Korean speaking counselors where they can talk about their own experiences. I think it's for our students to accept the level of their racial identities where they are. And I think it is definitely hard to provide programs that are applicable to everyone, but I think we try our best to build individual support. And I try to talk to my students on an individual basis and think about how we can best support them. One short example is we are planning for a summer book club where we'll select social justice focused books, and then we're going to be talking about those books with our international students. So we're just going to see what comes up, and we're just going to meet where they are.
That's really helpful, and it's also helpful and mindful too. I mean, certainly Arizona State and the University of Michigan, where Kelly is, are larger institutions, but some of these things, like being focused on the individual, I think are lessons that can be applicable to institutions with varying sizes with different levels of staffing in international student offices. Kelly Wagner, I want to bring you in and tap you. You've been working in the field of international education for a number of years, and particularly kind of at this intersection of international student services and social justice work. And I want to ask you a little bit about this past year to reflect on it. What has your work been like, and have you seen any kind of notable shifts as unfortunately some of these questions around racism and the international student population have come more to the forefront?
And I want to say, like, I really appreciate like Dr. Koo and Yuezhong and Ruwen's like comments, because I think they validate some of the thoughts that I've had around how we program for international students. I was thinking about like international students, if they haven't lived in a country that isn't mono-ethnic for the most part, like they haven't really experienced racism in the way that it exists in the United States until they get here, and they sort of get like the Instagram of the United States, and then they arrive here and then they see like what's really going on behind the scenes. And so it's informed the way I do my work for several years. But in the past year, I feel like people are more eager to actually have these conversations. So in many ways, while yes, it's been chaotic and it's unfortunate to see a lot of this stuff, the buy-in from other departments and faculty and staff across campus has been much more enthusiastic, and people are reaching out to us to get these conversations started in their own schools and colleges. And maybe my office isn't always the experts in that area, reaching out and partnering with like our multi-ethnic student affairs office and some of our student groups, and even resources from colleagues outside of University of Michigan too might be the best resource. But thinking about the work we do and getting this buy-in has been much easier. It felt like in the past, it was more me reaching out to people or me edging my way into conversations to make sure that international students were represented, that people remember that international students aren't this monolithic group, that they are very diverse within themselves and they have different needs depending on what country or what region they're coming from. And so that has been really exciting to see. On the downside for me personally, it's been harder to sort of have these one-on-one connections with students to see like what's really going on with campus. I don't bump into students in the lobby. I don't see them, and just have casual conversations with them. So it's harder to get these connections with students to really get a feel for how they're doing. But, I still work really closely with our International Student Council that we have in our office, and we've been meeting monthly still and talking to them to see like, how are you doing? What are the struggles that you're having? Even if you're studying remotely, in your home country, if you're here in the US, how are you feeling? Do you feel safe? Are you just really stressed out? And so helping students where they are right now, because they may not know how to process this, especially if it's the first time, especially with a lot of the anti-Asian rhetoric that's been going on. They may have had microaggressions, but maybe they haven't seen it as much in the forefront. So how can we talk with those students? How can we reach out to them? And getting as much student feedback about that as possible. So that has been really helpful, I would say. I've also just in general, the past 4 years, I think we've seen students having a much more difficult time, I think, related because of the former White House administration and changes in policies. So maybe it wasn't a brand new feeling for the international office, maybe compared to some of the other offices. We've been kind of slowly having a buildup to what was 2020. But I think that it's great to see so many other offices and departments and everyone much more invested in the past year than I have in the past.
Yeah, it's hard sometimes, I suspect, to sort of see the positive in all that's gone on in this past year, but that is an interesting point you make. I just want to again encourage people to post your questions. We already have a number of good ones that are coming in, and we'll make time for as many of them as we can get to. And I'm excited by the back and forth that I see in the chat as well. So please feel free to talk there. And our our staff here from the University of Kentucky is going to be continuing to put some resources and information about our panelists in there as well. Let me turn back and get to Ruwen again and ask you a little bit about, what Kelly just said. I mean, you spoke sort of movingly about your own kind of awakening, really, when you first came here 4 years ago, sort of seeing yourself almost through other people's eyes. But I certainly suspect this past year, not just with anti-Asian racism, but also with the Black Lives Matter protests and all that has happened here in the US has been an impactful one for you. And I wonder if you would be open to reflecting on what it's been like and if that has shaped some of your thinking further. You're on mute. Okay.
Oh, that's a really good question, and I already feel like my heart suddenly get really heavy just thinking about the answer of this question. Actually, COVID-19, this pandemic, only intensified racism, especially anti-Asian racism. It has always existed. It has a really long history, and immediately after I get to the US, sometimes I talk to my Chinese friends who are already here, and they told me their experience of when they go to a grocery store and they got called racial slurs or experience like this, and I just knew like it's something that may happen to me, just because the way I look. It's a very painful realization, but. Definitely during this pandemic that it really happened to me. I like take daily walks, just, that's my way to relax. And last summer, I was walking down the street. It's evening. It's the same street I walk almost every day. And then there's this truck drove by and yelled, "Go back to China," at me. I just immediately feel very, I don't know how to feel, I guess. My immediate response is fear. I just frozen there because I live in a very small town, and my immediate thought is, would this become any worse? I don't, it hurts when people yell at me, "Go back to China." But what I'm really afraid of, would this become any form of physical harm to me? And it really doesn't help to witness so many incidents of anti-Asian hate happening all over the country. To see that, people being chased on the street, being punched in the face, and it definitely changed mine, the way I carry myself, like throughout daily life. A few days ago, I was in a grocery store, just to try to pick out some veggie and fruits, and I noticed my body gets so tense every time when I feel like somebody was staring at me or walking toward me. It's like my body immediately get into this flee or fight response, like evaluating that person. It's really paranoid, right? It's ridiculous that I feel this way in my daily life, like going to grocery store is something you do so often. But I feel so bad, almost like blaming myself for feeling this way. But at the same time, I also know that this is a very natural and reasonable response, to all the violence that has been directed to people like me. I do hope one day I don't have to feel this way, but I really don't know how. Yeah, that's my experience.
As we just heard so poignantly and painfully, frankly, This is taking a real toll on individual students here in the US. And Katie, I know you've been looking at in your work, in your research, at international students' mental health and the impact that discrimination does have on their well-being. And I wonder if, I know it's ongoing, but it's also very urgent. And I wonder, so if you could talk a little bit about what some of your findings so far.
Sure. So my genuine motivation for my research is to support international students and Asian community. So speaking of my research, campus climate reflects the overall US racial climate, actually. When the US racial climate is hostile and against to the people of color in the country, then campus climate is also unwelcoming and unsafe to people of color, including international students of color, definitely. This is what I found from my research in my longitudinal project, the year 2016 and 2017, when the former president election and under the former president governments, there were many increased reports of racism throughout the US campuses. Also because the immigration regulations and laws were extremely against to international students around that year under the governments. This directly impacted to the campus climate negatively to international students of color, which made students mentally distressed severely as a consequence. In late 2016 and 2017, international students of color's depression rate and anxiety rate were increased compared to the previous years, not only for 2016 or 2017, but 2020 and 2021, currently, the entire racial climate in the US, we all know and we all see from the newspapers, and the campus climate have been seriously negative to people of color. As I found that campus climate and mental health are closely associated for students of color. Welcoming and safe campus climate and positive campus environment are the key to students' mental health and psychological well-being at the same time. So therefore, in addition to promoting mental health of international students of color or students of color and developing more mental health support programs for this population, making the campus climate more just, equitable, welcoming, and positive will also help international students and students of color's mental health ultimately. Some people might question how campus climate is related to mental health directly, but as we know, our surroundings and environments are directly impacting our sense of safety. And if we feel anxious of our environments, if we're anxious that if our environments are not safe, then it's a bad sign. And then also discrimination or experience of being treated unfairly or differently, those impact the self-esteem or the confidence or the daily life, the sense of safety, which are also directly impacting mental health eventually. So therefore, making the campus climate welcoming and safe to international students of color is extremely important to support international students' mental health ultimately. I'm happy to talk more about my research related to this topic. So please contact me individually if you want to learn more about my research or if you want to collaborate with me. So again, to conclude, mental health and campus climate are directly related, and people are impacted mentally with the surroundings and the campus climate. And because when it comes to international students and students of color, because their main surroundings are campus and the people around them. So that's why campus climate, positive campus climate, welcoming campus climate is very important for their mental health ultimately. Thank you for the question, Karen.
Well, thanks for the generous offer. I suspect you might be inundated with people now. Kelly, I want to turn back to you. I think if you know Kelly and you know her title, she's program manager for global engagement and study abroad, and that doesn't really adequately, I think, kind of reflect what the work that you do. And I think Michigan has a very interesting approach to dealing. And I see a lot of questions already in the chat about how you make some of these bridges between DEI work and the international office. And that is somewhat of what you do. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your role and your work.
Yeah, you read my mind. I was like, if you read my title, sometimes it's hard to tell exactly what I do. And so U of M, I used to work for the U of M Flint campus. I work for the U of M Ann Arbor campus now. So I've worked for a couple different areas of U of M and very different styles of campuses. But my role at U of M Ann Arbor, I started just over 4 years ago. And U of M started their diversity, equity, inclusion strategic plan 5 years ago. It was launched. So we're just hitting our 5-year anniversary and looking at like what the next phase of this will be. And they looked at and so my office is under the Division of Student Life, and they looked at student life and said, where are offices that are underserved in terms of staffing and where they could use more help to more intentionally do diversity, equity, inclusion work. So I was hired along with 4 other staff members around the same time in our gender identity and sexual orientation office, our Office of Multi-Ethnic Student Affairs, our Center for Campus Engagement, our Intergroup Relations department, and myself in the International Center. And so we were kind of hired on as a cohort model under the idea that we would collaboratively work together, work across the silos that we're all in at U of M. As I think many of you who are in large campuses know how decentralization can be hard to make things happen because everyone's kind of doing their own thing in separate silos. And so my role specifically looks at how can I serve as an ally for international students across campus? What committees can I be on? What sort of programming can I do for faculty and staff in order to help inform them of international student issues and culture change and intercultural communications and things like that? And how can I also create programs for international students in order to better familiarize them with US social justice, racism, and other types of programs that might be helpful for them? Because as we've talked before, suddenly whatever the US's idea of racism and social justice is now thrust upon them, and this new identity is now formed. So how do we prepare international students to interact with that? And how do I create spaces for international students so that they can have these conversations and feel comfortable doing it? Because sometimes they don't want to ask a question that might seem naive. They don't want to accidentally offend someone. So how can we create a space for international students to ask those questions and have those conversations? And so I've been really intentional, and I have a great team in my office as well. And it's not just me doing this work, but how can I work with folks across campus and get them involved? And so I've been really intentional about partnering with those offices to make sure that we are doing programming for international students or having a conversation around the international student experience. So even when they're doing their own programs, they have a better understanding of maybe a perspective an international student might be coming from when they're doing their own, bias response trainings and things like that. So those are the sort of programs that we've been intentionally trying to plan. I don't want to take up too much time. So people have questions, they can always email me and we can talk more one-on-one. But that's sort of what my role can be summarized as in 3 minutes.
Yeah, sorry, you're a little under the clock for that. I apologize. I think obviously the Michigan example is an interesting one. It's a very sort of intentional model, and not every institution is going to duplicate that. And we have a nice sort of connection here again between Kelly and Yuezhong, who was at Michigan. And so I want to ask you a little bit about you went from being a grad student in Michigan, you went to Arizona State, you had this role, but obviously not quite the same kind of, growth out of the strategic plan that Kelly had. So how did you incorporate some of the lessons that you learned and what you saw at Michigan?
Sure, thank you for the question. I spent 2 years completing my master's program in higher education in Ann Arbor, and I was part of the International Council that Kelly mentioned earlier. I think there are 2 parts of my experience that have informed what I'm trying to do right now at ASU. One of them was part of my graduate internship experience with this global social justice focused living learning community. It's called the Global Scholars Program. And I was kind of learning alongside the undergraduate students who are in the program, both international exchange students as well as domestic students. We came together and we learned about social justice issues anywhere from environmental justice, social identities, oppression, privilege, and all of that. And then what I was seeing Kelly's office was doing is that she was hosting this Lunch and Learn series for international students, talking about similar issues that I mentioned. So during my time in Michigan, well, actually, when I just got there, I never realized that you could talk to international students directly about racial identities and social justice issues in the US, because with my experience that I mentioned, I just thought that this is something that I got to figure out on my own. This is something that I need to learn from, the classes that I took if I had the time. And if not, it's just solely on my own to Google and ask friends about it and things like that. So it was really kind of opening up a whole new world for me, where, Kelly's office and the program that I mentioned was directly talking to international students, even short-term exchange students about social justice in the US. And I think a lot of international students are really interested, and I think it's really helpful. And I think for me, learning about social identities and intersectionalities within the context of US, I realized that a lot of my lived experiences were validated in those discussions. That was something that I never realized before. So after I started working at ASU, I connected one of our program coordinator, Kara, with Kelly. So Kara actually started doing Lunch and Learn series as well at ASU for one academic year until, COVID happened and we couldn't do lunch together anymore. But my colleague actually started doing a lot of weekly workshop series. And 1 week will focus on one very specific issue. For example, we talked about free speech, US dating culture, what is religion, gender, sexual orientation, the African American experience in the US, the Native American experience in the US, disability issues. And the attendance, there's always ups and downs with attendance, but I think in general, I like the format where it's a series of events, because these kind of topics can never be solved or talked about in one setting. And then last summer, after the murder of George Floyd, we organized a town hall community discussion for our international students, and we talked about the experience of the history of civil rights movement and the history of Black Lives Matter. And we just provided a platform for our students and scholars to ask questions. And we also provided ways for them to engage in these issues at their level of comfort. So I think there can be reactionary events after tragic incidents like that. And then there should also be a series of kind of ongoing workshops to provide the ongoing education discussion with our students.
That's a really interesting way to think about it, to be both reactive and supportive in that moment, but also to be proactive and to have kind of this continuity of programming. I want to stay with you for a second and just ask a little bit more. I mean, I see a lot of these people I think are in the audience are a little bit where you were, which is coming to this, trying to think like, where do I begin? And I wonder, I mean, you've talked about some things that have worked. Are there things that you tried that didn't? I mean, not that we all like to talk about, we like to all focus on our successes, but are there things that you tried that didn't work as well? Do you have any advice for international educators who may be just trying to really begin getting program going on their campuses?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's always trial and error. And I'm very grateful to be in an office where I think innovative ideas and trial and error are highly encouraged. I think I am given the freedom where I could think of a kind of discussion topic today and then host an event next week with a few of my colleagues. I would say that don't be afraid to try something new. And I think for most of us who are working in higher education, we have at least a bachelor's degree, and a lot of you have master's and doctoral degrees. And I always say that our past education has definitely given us the tool and the experience to learn something on our own first, right? That's the purpose of education. We always can learn something on our own and collaborate with colleagues within your office just to try a few things. I think depending on your existing programming structure, maybe if you already have an ongoing, let's say, weekly coffee conversation or weekly community gathering with your international students, and maybe, you know, add a few topics in here and there, and post the questions and ask what your international students think about it. And I think depending on the level of understandings of the students that you serve regarding social justice and racial tensions in the US, you could, you know, think about planning going forward what would be most applicable for the population that you serve. And I will also say that get your international students involved. A lot of them are very advocacy oriented, you know, even a lot more than I've expected before. They are very eager to learn, very eager to lead those kind of conversation. So I think definitely use your student leaders on campus that you already have a relationship with, and start from there. And another thing our office started last year is a few of my colleagues and I started a internal inclusion conversation group, and we just take turns every 2 or 3 weeks to facilitate a discussion topics focusing on one of the social justice issues for our colleagues to join in and talk about it. And I think for the last year or so, we hosted, I think, almost 10 conversations. And I think looking back, we've definitely made progress within our office to bring more staff members on board where they would, you know, be timid and a little bit, you know, uncomfortable when talking about these issues a year ago. But then as we have more and more of these conversations, I've noticed that a lot more of my colleagues are, you know, feeling more comfortable on talking about social identities and privilege and oppression. So I think, you know, start something small within your office and get a few colleagues involved and see what you can grow from there.
I mean, that's an interesting point, because education is not just for the students, it's for all of us as well. And this is a constantly evolving challenge that we all face. Kelly, I want to ask you somewhat the same question about some advice that you have from your work. And I'm particularly interested, you started talking about this before, but your office does kind of act as a bit of or your role rather, does act as a bit of a bridge. And I think one of the challenges that folks in international education face often is that the resources for doing this work are someplace else on campus. And so if you have thoughts about how to make those connections too, that would be terrific.
Yeah, and I mean, I just want to echo what Yuezhong said, like, don't be afraid to try things and don't feel like you need to be the expert. I think that's how I've approached it too. Like, I am not an expert in every single area of social justice work and race and identity and oppression and privilege. Like, I'm a great generalist. I'm not the expert in every single one of those areas, but I know the folks that are. And so how can I bring them in to like co-present with me and lead these workshops or lunch and learn series, and get them involved. And even at U of M, like our office, again, we're strapped for resources and like, what can I do for free? What can I do? And can I get academic units involved that might have more resources? Can they pay for the space? And then we come and we present for their staff. Like, how can we work together and how can I build these partnerships? Because that's the best way to get things done too, but also you're getting other offices involved. And that's sort of how I've always approached it and said, like, where are our students too? Because we want to make sure it's not just student life, it's also within their college and academic units too. Because that's where they're probably spending a lot more time maybe than they are within student life. Also making sure that like people within your office are on board with things, getting them involved as much as possible, collaborating with others, because maybe their experiences could be really helpful depending on what topic you're talking about that time or what program you're hosting. And so we've been really intentional about getting our international student advisors involved in certain trainings and programs that we're doing as well, so that they're not just seeing advisors just as like the immigration person. There's someone they can come to later if they're feeling uncomfortable, if they're really stressed out, if they're feeling unsafe. Like, how can they still feel comfortable with the advisors and not be worried just about immigration matters when they're in those advising appointments? Another thing we've done too, and I think someone mentioned this in the chat about like international students may not feel comfortable reporting incidents of bias. And so we even started at orientation. We have a social justice 101 presentation that's part of orientation. We talk about what are microaggressions. You know, someone's going to tell you their pronouns when they introduce themselves. Why are they doing that if you haven't experienced that before, if it's not part of the culture you're from? And especially in an academic setting, that's even more of a unique experience where people do that more conscientiously. And so how do we make sure students are aware of these things before classes even start? And so they can understand that reporting is going to be okay, it'll be anonymous, and that you shouldn't let things like this happen. You know, I know that sometimes international students, they don't want to like ruffle feathers, they don't want to be a problem or a burden, they're just a guest. And so how do we make sure that students feel empowered to report things if they are happening? And so we try to get that messaging out as soon as we can. And we continue to do that at orientation. And we may, and again, we're constantly trying to evolve this. So how that presentation looks changes a bit from year to year, and it might look completely different again this fall based on everything that's happened in the past year. So that's definitely something I think that is important to do as well.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. So you're not putting all the burden on the students themselves, but like constantly kind of saying, you know, we're here to be your partners in this and to be a resource and someone you can lean on. Katie, I want to come back to you. I mean, you talked a little bit about your research, and I know your work does bridge this sort of counseling and higher ed, international education and student services work. And so I wonder specifically, are there ways that you think international offices can be partnering specifically with campus mental health and health centers to support, you know, students in some of the challenges that you've articulated before?
Thank you for the question, Karen. Very important question. So, well, to answer to this question, first, I would like to share some questions that I received from other audience from my previous lecture or the webinars on international students. Because, you know, we should know what other people think and perceive about international students so that we can provide better services for international students. So here are some examples. Some administrators and faculty said that international students don't get help, or they said international students are vulnerable and weak, or sometimes I heard that international students did not speak in the class, so I did not know what was going on to them. Other examples are like, what are the resources for international students improve their English, something like that. So oftentimes, well, the reason why I just speak for these examples, oftentimes I felt that administrators and faculty think it's international students' fault. I got that impression many times. I even heard that a staff member said international students need more resiliency, they are weak, something like that. Here are my answers. So there must be a reason why international students hesitate to seek for help. There must be a reason why international students look weak or vulnerable to administrators or faculty member. I observed that international students experience that many services and programs are very US centric, and those services did not really help for international students specifically. I also saw some of these impressions from our chat box, if you can check. So please don't blame international students that they don't utilize resources, or please don't blame that they don't speak up, or please don't criticize their English proficiency. But please know why they say that. Why they say that most programs are US centric and those are not really applicable to them, and try to create international student friendly services and programs, not the US centric programs. International students are a group of high resiliency because they left their familiar environment and their families and took the courage to study abroad and survive in a foreign country. This is true. This means that they are strong and they have great potential. So please do not find reason from them, so not from them, but create and pursue the way to include them genuinely. So it is very important to understand it is not their fault. It is not that international students are lacking something or they are deficient, but it is just because their involvement in the US centric, because they are marginalized student in this foreign country. This is just the involvement. So this is a starting point to have culturally responsive programs for international students. So please get rid of those culturally insensitive or culturally unresponsive US-centric programs and think about from international students' positions. So for culturally responsive programs for mental health, please create supportive space and programs first that works for international students. Well, I spend too much time just to advocate for international students' perspective, but to help them mentally, to support them mentally, I think the first stage is to fully understand what they need, and please don't focus on their deficient part. It's not like they're lacking or that they're not weak. They have high resiliency. So please think about the current program, how the current program is US-centric, how the programs can be more culturally sensitive, culturally responsive. I'll stop here, but I'm happy to continue this conversation later.
I mean, that's an excellent point. I mean, I think it's troubling sometimes that we have this as sort of a deficit conversation. And if that's your starting point, that sort of sets up the whole, all that you do in this way that may not be, or often is not very useful. Ruwen, I want to turn to you and ask you, you're an expert, obviously, in this experience that you've had. What would you like to see colleges do? Do you have advice for our audience?
Thank you for the question, Karen. I definitely echo what Katie has said, because honestly, at the beginning of this panel, I started to feel a little bit uncomfortable because it seems like the conversation is about how to teach international students to know more about US culture, to act like a real American, and that just further deepen my my feeling of alienation, like I am different. Why can't this different just exist, right? Why can't this be a mutual process of learning from each other, getting to know each other? So for me, I think there's one thing that can really, just reflecting from my own experience on campus is hire more faculty staff or administrators that have experience of being international students, or have lived in different culture and that understand cultural differences. Like we talk about, I noticed in the chat, lots of people, some are international students and some work at campus, and they all mention one thing is that international students hesitant to reach out for services on campus. Like, for example, my university has a really good counseling center that's free for students. But they all, I talked to my therapist and they mentioned that they have trouble getting international students come to them. And honestly, I'm not surprised. Like, just think about yourself. Like when you talk about deep emotional issues, like even if you are a native speaker of English, you feel like you have trouble finding the right words. You feel like ashamed or vulnerable to do it, right? And think about this for someone who, English is their second language. And it's just like double or triple vulnerability there. And I think, if counseling centers can hire someone who can speak, for example, Chinese or Japanese, or a language, or a language that's that actually meets the students' need, and that would definitely help students to feel more comfortable to use the service. Same is for other department. Like when I go submit my tax document to payroll office, sometimes I can notice the people, work there, staff work there, try to make jokes with me, try to talk friendly, but the jokes they made are very cultural specific jokes that it's hard for me to respond naturally when I hear a joke that I don't know why it's so funny. So I think these are all examples of how by hiring more people that have international experience, we can actually we can actually help international students to use campus service more frequently.
Thank you for saying that. Unfortunately, we are almost out of time, but I want to ask to all of you one question, and I also want to say I'm gonna try to take some of the very great questions that you all have posed, and I want to continue to try to do programming around this. I mean, I think it's quite clear we could probably talk not just for an hour, but 24 hours about this subject and not have exhausted all aspects of this. But I want to ask all of our panelists just to reflect a little bit on this idea, which is how do you balance being supportive of your international students in this work without also making them feel like they're being singled out and in some ways marginalizing them? Katie, did you have any thoughts?
I have many thoughts. I'm thinking about the time, but first thing that I want to speak up for international students, maybe I might sound too radical because I am also a former Asian international student. Look at those data and look at those publications or the tenure and promotion outcomes. A lot of publications, a lot of presentation, or a lot of outcomes like patents or any other, obvious outcomes, they are coming from international students, really. So, international students are wonderful resources, and they contribute a lot to the U.S. society and also U.S. higher education and in many other knowledge parts. So, and it's true, and it's really not well advertised that way. So I think that can be a good point, or that can be a good starting point that we can really emphasize how precious to have many international students who contribute to this society. I think just emphasizing that part is really good points and really a good starting parts. And I really like to emphasize how thankful that we are for having international students, having these great resources, great contributions. I have 10,000 different things that I want to talk, but I want to pass this to other speakers.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists. I'm sorry that we didn't get to more of the questions and have more time. We did record this. We will be sharing that with you. We'll also be going back through and making sure that all of the great resources that both our panelists have provided, but also some of you put in the chat, we'll try to make sure those get included as well. I appreciate your questions. Like I said, I think that they are fodder for future panels, and also selfishly, they are fodder for me in my reporting. Just as we've said, this is not some of our panelists have said, dealing with this issue is not something you deal with once. It's not a static point in time. It's something that I want to keep writing about and putting a spotlight on. So I really appreciate the outstanding questions. And again, I just want to applaud our panel. Thank you so much, all of you, for sharing your perspective and your wisdom and your insight. And thanks to the University of Kentucky for being a great partner to Latitudes in putting this on in the Office of China Initiative. So thanks, Madeline and Huazhen and everyone there. So I look forward to seeing all of you soon. And again, thank you.